Hello there, and welcome to My Job Workshop for the Leadership Board if you're using Simplified Accountable Structure. And it's great to have you aboard. It's great to have you in leadership. Thank you for spending some time engaged in and investing in your local church. And so this webinar is designed for these leadership board members, and it really is only designed so if you're currently using Simplified Accountable Structure, if you're thinking about using it, it might be helpful too. But please know there's a whole transition process between discerning and beginning the implementation process, and then really moving into and living into what it means to be a part of this Simplified Accountable Structure, the single leadership board governing your church. And so I'm Blake Bradford. I'm the presenter. I'm the Northwest District Superintendent, and I'm co-author of a couple of different books. I did Impact a while back, and Impact is about lay ministry, and co-wrote it with Kay Cotan as I did my other books. And a few years ago, we wrote a book on simplified structure called Mission Possible. And what we found out was that we were learning a whole lot about simplified structure. We were learning a whole lot from it being practiced around the country. And so we came up with another book, and that is the third edition of Mission Possible now, which I don't know if you noticed, we made it a lot bigger. 300 pages of a resource. There's a little bit of irony, of course, in having a 300-page book on simplified structure. But the point is, we designed it with the idea that when you're moving into this model, that there's a whole discernment period you need to work through. There's a period of equipping both your prospective board and your nominations committee, and getting the structure just right, and working with your superintendent to vote on it. And then that whole first year of implementation about what it means to really live into that model. And what we're going to be learning about today is more of that implementation, that first, second, those convenient years of living into the model of having a single governing board that operates with several different hats. And when we designed the book, we designed it with all these three different pieces, and then a whole huge 50-page section just on resources that you could photocopy and share and utilize. So we designed to be real user-friendly, kind of an owner's manual. You'll find some of this material also on my personal website, blakebradford.org, and I hope that's a help to you. But let's dive in to what we'll be doing today. And that is, if you're currently on a leadership board, you're a member of one of these simplified structure boards that may be new to your church, maybe done it for a few years, but how do you operate like this? And what does it mean to be a member of this board that does wear all these hats? So let me show you some course objectives. I'm going to share my screen again. So here's the course objectives. First of all, to equip you all, the members of leadership boards, in your governance responsibilities, particularly the fiduciary duties and the work of accountable leadership. The second objective is to connect best practices and the book of discipline requirements to the work of the simplified accountable structure leadership boards. And when we talk about best practices, that's more the kind of the technical work of the board, such as executive sessions and facility care and work teams and the use of a prepared leadership packet. And if some of these words sound really foreign right now, well, don't worry, we'll catch up and we'll talk about that. The third is to guide you all as leadership boards in fulfilling all your responsibilities in a holistic way. Because when you're this leadership board, you're probably serving as the staff parish relations committee, the trustees, the finance committee, and the church council. You may also be serving as the endowment committee of the church, and you also may be responsible for a child care facility. So I recognize that. Now, here's some things I want to say about this workshop, just so you're clear and so that we're clear about our terms and everything. I realize as a superintendent that in my own district, 125 churches of varying size, that different size churches live into this model very differently. And there's different expectations of pastor. There's the board has different kinds of responsibilities depending on your church size and some stuff about context. I also know that moving into this model is been done in very many different diverse variant ways throughout our conference here in Arkansas. And so some of the ways I may be describing this may be slightly different than what you're using. What I'll say is I'm going to show a baseline way, sort of the preferred model. I know that certainly on church size, there may be some differentiation. And I realize that. And as you live into that, you may want to be in conversation with your superintendent. The second thing I want to say is that, and clearly the difference on context there, some of you may have set up some structures that you kind of live into this model slightly differently, especially in the way of different hats. We'll talk about that in the committee and how your membership of a committee. When I get into that, you're going to hear some stuff that may push you a little bit. And there's a reason for that. And that is this simplified structure has now been enacted all over the country. Hundreds of churches are using it, 100 United Methodist churches. And we have learned some stuff. And there's some models that were shown and practiced, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when this model was starting to be used, that over time we have discovered have maybe caused some trouble, been challenging, maybe didn't live into the model fully. And so the reason why we're on the third edition of the book, and the reason why we're sharing the material as we are, is these are lessons learned from around the country. And I've always said it's really great to learn, from the mistakes of others or the challenges of others or the experience of others. And so when we talk about this preferred system, this is really what we're talking about is what we've learned over time is the best path. Now, again, there will be some variances based upon some contextual issues in church size, and I understand that. Now, the last piece as we jump in to the workshop is this is a recorded workshop. So if you need to take a break in the middle, you can do that. You can hit pause. You can fast forward if you need to. You can rewind and listen to a segment again. We have provided this webinar tool as an opportunity to have this recorded workshop, and then to be providing through your superintendent, your district offices, other folks to assist you further and answer more questions. So this gives you the baseline information you can share with the whole committee instead of driving somewhere to hear a workshop. And then the best practice here would be to then have some Q&A time or just talk to your superintendent about how to work through some of the challenges or the unique context you're living into. So let's jump right in with some information about the simplified structure. I'm going to share my screen again. And back here we are, back to the objectives. And so when we talk about simplified structure, the first thing I want to say is this is a model that is provided for in our discipline. And so when you look in the discipline and you look at paragraph 247.2, you see a passage about modifying the organizational plans. Now, note in this, the charge conference, the DS, and the pastor shall organize and administer the pastoral charge in churches according to the policies and plans herein set forth in the discipline. And then there's an openness to context about membership size and program scope and mission resources, other circumstances. It says that in consultation with and the approval of the DS, the church can modify your organizational plans, and provided the provisions of 243 are observed. And people say, what's 243? 243 means you keep on being a United Methodist Church involved in ministry, ministries of nurture and outreach and witness of Christ. So as long as you're fulfilling those actions and you're following the rest of the disciplinary pieces, you can do a lot of stuff with the approval of your DS. Now, here's what I'll say. There are a lot of models floating around. When my co-author and I, we came up with the system that we share and preferred, we have designed it so that all the disciplinary passages for all the committees remain fully enforced and in effect. We have worked really hard to provide a system that's very clear and every one of the disciplinary rules continues to be followed. It's just followed in a way that consolidates the responsibilities of all the committees. Now, this can be a bit complicated when you look at this passage. And so here's what I'll say. Once again, and you'll hear me say it several times, call your DS with any paragraph 247.2 questions. If you go online and ask, the clergy Facebook group or something like, you'll find all kinds of answers. That doesn't mean they're all kinds of helpful answers. And so I really encourage you, with any questions, go first to your superintendent and then work from there, because your superintendent can help guide you and your congregation along those ways. And if you notice, let's go look at the paragraph, the DS must be involved in all this process. If you're a church that's considering simplified structure and you're kind of reading ahead and this is what this is about, please know that there should be a whole discernment process, a consultation process. I've got some training stuff on my own end and in the book that can help you and your DS work through that. Again, this workshop's not going to contain that information. It's going to assume that you're already living into the model. So again, talk to your DS. Now, when we talk about this simplified structure model, here's what the leadership board looks like. You notice, first of all, and I want to be really clear about this, who's at the top of the structure? Jesus Christ. The Great Commission is our mission. Our whole responsibility, make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's who we are. That's what we're about. If you think about us in the Arkansas conference, of course, we understand our trajectory as an annual conference is very clear, and it's rooted in this Great Commission. And part of what I'm doing here in this workshop is helping to fulfill this trajectory of creating vital congregations that make disciples of Jesus Christ, who make disciples equipped and sent to transform lives, communities, and the world. So that is at the top, our mission, our trajectory, and Jesus Christ himself. And then all of our ministries roll up underneath. We're all accountable to this Great Commission. That's why we call it simplified accountable structure. We're all accountable to this Great Commission and our mission as United Methodist. If you notice in this chart, you have our Church in Charge Conference. That's the lead governing agency, the connection to the annual conference, when we vote on things like pastor's compensation or legal action, or if you see, maybe some of you may even do your budget with the Charge Conference or the Charge Conference. And then you have the annual Charge Conference materials that you submit that has different reports about membership. And for instance, taking a roll audit or remembering those who have passed on in the last year, and you list all those names. That all happens at the Charge Conference. The other thing that happens at Charge Conference is leaders are elected. And so you see a blue box called Nominations Committee. Nominations Committee connects up to Charge Conference, and they're a separate and independent group listed in the discipline as a separate paragraph that will elect your leadership. Now, in simplified accountable structure, usually only two committees are elected. You got your Nominations Committee and your Leadership Board. The rest of the ministries are all selected, not elected. But let's look at this where the Leadership Board fits in. You notice the Leadership Board in this function operates as similar to an executive committee of the Charge Conference, because the Charge Conference will only meet, usually annually, maybe a special called session. That means the month-to-month governing and the working with the pastor and any kind of day-to-day or week-to-week work has to happen through a different body. And that is the Leadership Board, which is the church council. It also serves as trustees, staff parish, and finance. They're responsible for governance, strategy, and accountability. And you see how part of that accountability leads to the pastor. And then all the ministries continue. Now, this has been one of those things that we have to explain a lot, because when we talk, some folks use the term single board structure for this model. We don't like that term. I prefer to use simplified accountable structure. And the reason is there's other teams, ministry teams do continue. You may have, like I see, a lay ministry team leaders there. You may have a team that's involved in ministerial outreach, connecting to the community. You may have another one like the worship planning team. You may have some church staff that also relates to ministry teams. One piece we encourage is a building maintenance team. And so you have different ministry teams that are accountable to the mission, but also accountable to the pastor. And the pastor then is held accountable by this leadership board. And so you notice there's a little side branch. The pastor, by discipline, is always the chair of the nominating committee. So there's a role there of the pastor as well. Now, I do want to be clear that in differently sized churches, the role of pastor particularly shifts around some. There may be multiple pastors on staff. The role of pastor in a smaller church is going to look a little differently than a much larger church about their role in leading and vision casting. And so I make space for that. And I think y'all need to make space for it as well when you look at your model and figure out the right balance of leadership there with that role of the senior pastor. Now, in addition to this chart, I want to dive into a little more about who serves on that leadership board. Who is this group that is elected by the charge conference to serve in this role? And so here's the list. It should have 9 members and 3 annual classes. Now, in our very small churches, you might have 6 members and 3 classes. And what I mean by classes is everyone serves a 3-year term. And so that means, when you did your charge conference document this last fall, you should have had 3 classes. And that means you had a class of 22, a class of 23, and a class of 24. That means in the class of 22 on December 31st, 2022, 1/3 of your board rolls off. And then the next year, another 1/3 rolls off. And every year you're getting another 3 people added to the board. And so 9 members, 3 in each class. Including this total is your board chair, which should be selected there by the nominating committee and elected as part of the group. You may also include in the 9 members, the lay member to annual conference and lay leader. They can be a part of the 9, or they could be 2 separate ones that serve in a slightly different function. For instance, only the 9 in the 3 classes can be members of the board of trustees, for example. And so we want to be real clear about that. But, like a lay leader, lay member annual conference, which could be the same person, by the way, they may serve separately from the 9, but if they do that, they can't be a trustee. So you can see already it gets a little complicated. And that's why you need to keep in touch with your superintendent to make sure all the rules are being followed, because the 9 members all serve, every one of them, all 9, as the staff parish, the trustees, the finance, and the church council. And here's the real kicker here. When we think about the book of discipline rules about these 9, I want to be real clear that all the rules, like there is for every one of those committees, I could look up in the paragraphs, there's a whole set of rules about staff parish committee. Guess what? All those qualifications must apply to this simplified leadership board. If I turn in the 2500s, I'll look up the board of trustees, and there's rules about the 9 board of trustees, 9 members. Guess what? All the qualifications apply. And that means number of men and women on the board. All those rules apply. Finance committees, same thing. Church council. So what we've done is you take all the qualifications all lined up, and all those qualifications must apply to those 9 people. So it's at times it feels like a little bit of an algebra problem and arithmetic problem there, because you're trying to line up multiple sets of qualifications. That is why you have to be very intentional when you design your board. So that's the board. And let me share another piece now that may help you kind of understand how the board lives into this role. And that is, I'll share again. It's one board, and they operate with several hats. And one way to imagine this is, imagine just like the image I have in front of you, you have everyone around the table. And in front of them are finance and staff parish trustees and ad council or church council hats. Well, as you're moving through your agenda, you're putting on the different hats. If you're dealing with a personnel issue, you might move to an executive session. I'll tell more about that, and put on your staff parish hat. If you're dealing with a property issue, or maybe we had, a legal issue that your church is trying to deal with, you put on your trustee hat. Maybe you're talking about the church budget and you're looking at the financials. Well, everybody, all 9 of you plus the pastor, put on your finance hat. And so this one board is responsible for leadership and governance. All these committee functions are vested in the single board. And what I want to be real clear is, you don't separate out and say that there is 3 people who staff parish and 3 finance and 3. Nope, don't do it. It's a temptation to use specialists or representatives is a temptation that we have found over years will not be helpful. Because what it does is, if 3 people say, well, you 3 are the trustees, you wear the trustee hat, you 3 wear staff parish, what happens is you become each of those groups becomes a mini committee. And now what you've done is you've reverted back to the old system, the legacy model with all the committees, but you've done so with the improper number of people on each committee. And you've broken up all the adaptive, all the power and responsibility and authority and value of having a unified leadership board. And so what we suggest is, do not use representatives. Instead, the whole board needs to operate as the whole board. In other words, the whole board, all 9 are staff parish. There's no specialist. Every one of them is staff parish. Every one of the 9 is trustees if you're over the age of 18. Every one of you is the church council. Don't divvy it up. The leadership board is all these at once. And to help, now that I've kind of talked about the hats, I'm going to take it and add another whole layer to it and make it even more complicated. Because while the leadership board wears all the hats of church council and finance and trustees, these book of discipline functions are now approached in a really holistic way. And the Simplified Accountable Structure Board can now claim opportunities and face challenges with all the resources and all the authority of the whole congregation. And so really what we need is leaders to have a holistic leadership lens. And the image I have is I try to think, okay, how can we wear all the hats simultaneously? So, well, here's my all the hats simultaneously hat. And they tell us somewhere in leadership school, don't wear a funny hat, but I'm just going to do it. I've got my funny hat on. It's my propeller hat. And I know it's a little silly. You got to work with me. But if you imagine wearing all the hats of church council and staff parish and finance and trustees in a holistic way, well, here you go. You're wearing all the colors simultaneously to be that leadership board. Now, the other thing I'll say about this silly hat I'm wearing is it's got this little propeller on the top. And I'm actually, that's part of the metaphor I'm going to run with. And I'll say, when you wear all the hats simultaneously, you also need to do kind of strategic work and visioning work. And that involves getting up to the balcony, what Ronald Heifetz called getting up to the balcony view. You might also call it, getting a 25,000 foot view of the situation of the whole landscape. Getting up above the ground level management role and getting a strategic balcony or 25,000 foot view of this ministry landscape and cultural landscape above it. So to do that, oh gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this. I've got the propeller on top so I can get up to the balcony. So I can get up and have a whole ministry landscape. So actually, this has become a perfect metaphor, funny as it is, for this kind of leadership. You have all the color hats on, and you get up to the balcony. You get up, and your leadership board's job is to look holistically and look at the whole landscape. We don't want to get stuck in parochial concerns of, is the choir mad at the Sunday school or something like that. Instead, can you get above all that and look at the whole system and look at, again, beyond the church system, beyond the stained glass and beyond the brick to the world around us? And what is God calling us to do to transform the world, to transform lives, communities, and the world around us? Well, to do that, we've got to get beyond the day-to-day and look into the world and see where God's calling us. And to do that, you got to get a good view of things. The other piece of that is you get to use all the resources, because here's one of the challenges I've seen. When we have the different committees, we have the staff parish committee looking at every problem as a staffing problem, or maybe the pastor's fault, or the pastor's responsibility only. And we don't think about the other pieces, because that's not their job. Their job's personnel. And if we're on the board of trustees, we're looking at everything through the lens of maybe the building and the facilities, and do we have the right facilities? If you're finance, maybe you're thinking, oh man, how are we going to pay for all this? When you put all those responsibilities onto one board, you look at problems and challenges and opportunities in a holistic way. So it's not just a personnel issue or a facility, or you look at all the pieces simultaneously, and you have all the resources and all the of the church to be able to bring to bear for these opportunities and these challenges. So I'm going to keep my hat, is what I'm saying, with my little propeller on it. Now, I'd like to move a little bit and talk a bit more about some of the principles of simplified accountable structured leadership boards, because when you're in this model, there are some things you need to remember. And the first piece is the responsibilities of governance. Now, here's what I'll say. Even if you're not in this model yet, but if you're reading ahead, these responsibilities of governance, they apply to your church council and your other administrative committees there as well. There's 4 responsibilities of governance: stewardship, accountable leadership, generative, and strategic. And I'll break these down real quickly. Stewardship is all the fiduciary responsibilities. You have buildings, you have bank accounts, you have some personnel policies and people that you're responsible to, and they're responsible to you. You're stewarding. These are all God's resources, and we are called to be good stewards of God's resources. So the whole church is an institution we are the stewards of when you're in an elected position, a board position. The second is the accountable leadership piece. And my belief is, if you have a well-aligned, impact-focused ministry, to have that happen, you have to create a culture. And while the leadership board may not be in the day-to-day, every little piece of it, you do create an overall culture that starts with your relationship with their pastor, and then all the rest of the ministry teams roll under that. So accountable leadership is important, because we're all accountable to what again? The mission of the church, the great commission that Jesus gave us. Now, to be accountable to something, you have to say, well, what are we accountable to? How do we live into this vision? And that's that generative and strategic work, discerning God's dream, figuring out the big priorities, and then on the strategic, taking those priorities, taking the resources of the church, aligning them to those priorities the congregation has, and to transform the world, to impact lives. And so you imagine these 4 responsibilities of governance, and your board, if you're not living into these, no one else will. You can't expect your worship team to do all this work, or maybe your witness and outreach team. Your board and your pastor have to team up for these responsibilities of governance. If you're not handling this, there's nowhere else in the system this work can be done. Now, in today's workshop, what we're going to focus on is going to be only the first 2, stewardship and accountable leadership. There's other resources out there to do generative and strategic work, and we'll get to that in other ways. But I really, in today's workshop, because this is about a My Job workshop, we're going to focus just on these 2. So let me kind of take each of those in hand. First, again, for stewardship, here's what we need to imagine. The policies of the church. You may have personnel policies, facility use, all that. Resources like your money, your church vans, there's personnel involved, facilities that you take care of, and your fiduciary work. And it starts here with the book of discipline, contracts you may have some tenants. If you lease space, there's a lot of different ways you do stewardship of God's people and God's resources. And so there's the stewardship piece. We also have the accountable leadership piece. We talk about accountable leadership again, that's creating that culture. So you have your leadership board. It's accountable to Christ for leading the church in its vision. I have there a kind of a target with an arrow. So where's your target? Where are you aiming for? Because if we aren't aiming somewhere, then we'll be really random with our ministry. So helping the whole church understand where we're aiming. I think the board holds the pastor accountable, and the pastor holds the staff, and if there's any, paid or unpaid, and ministry leaders are accountable. But who are we accountable to? Again, the Great Commission. For accountable leadership, another piece is I suggest using a leadership covenant and agreeing with each other. Okay, if we're board members, we have all this authority, and that means we have all this responsibility. And responsibility can be a heavy mantle. So let's have a covenant together on how we're going to interact with each other, how when people may talk to us about the pastor or talk to us about this, how we're going to handle that, how we're going to boundary ourselves appropriately. Because with all this authority and responsibility, we need to make sure, because it is a sacred honor and a sacred privilege to hold this power, to hold this authority. We need to hold it well, and we need to hold it in ways that are biblical and true to what God's calling is. And so in this your term of service, how we operate as a fiduciary, all this matters. And the way we can be really clear about these responsibilities is to write a leadership covenant. Also, we'll suggest some guiding principles, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. It's a little similar to bylaws, but we'll tuck in. We'll get into that in a little bit. The last piece is on accountable leadership is listening. Listening to the community, listening to your church, responding to a changing context, and then sharing the story of what God is doing through ongoing communications. It'd be really easy when you have a simplified board to get isolated. And so staying in kind of getting good feedback and communicating, having a good communication loops, that's going to be really important for your board. And you all will set the culture that will exist in the whole church of not being isolated, not being disconnected, but staying deeply connected and in communication. So when we talk about stewardship and accountable leadership, that's the pieces we're talking about there. Now, on the disciplinary hats, and of course, I've again got my little silly propeller hat here. Let's take each of those in hand. I want to talk about church council and staff parish and finance trustees. We're going to dig into each of those and see, as you're switching from hat to hat, what those responsibilities will look like. Now, again, I'm going to use the terms of switching hats, and that's true. I mean, you do, but you really remember, we're always wearing all the hats simultaneously at least to some degree. So there's always going to be overlap, and we always need to stay holistic in our approach to ministry. So let's dig into each one of these. The first one is the church council hat. That's your administrative board or church council. So this is really an overarching hat. If you served on church council before, moving to this leadership team model actually may feel pretty familiar, because you do have this overarching responsibility for the church's mission and governance. And so again, to look at that model, when you're wearing that hat, you're really serving as the executive committee of the charge conference. And that's your role there when you're wearing that church council hat, that leadership of the leadership board. Now, I'm often asked, how does a single leadership board cover all the work of 4 committees? Because I've been on church councils many times, and we're hearing reports from different committees. They did a lot of work between each session. Well, the way you accomplish it is through a couple different methods. One is you don't handle every decision in isolation. You set up some guiding principles and policies. So instead of managing the day-to-day operation ministries of the church, you build these guiding principles are the way you get there. And here's what I mean by that. I'm using, if you see an image of this sports field, the guiding principles are the fencing. They say what is in and out. And this is so that, a fun game can be played inside the fence, but you don't want the ball rolling out in the street so the kid gets run over. And so guiding principle says, okay, here's the outside fencing. Here's the large rules that we say this is in, this is out. And once you make that one decision, guess what? Now it's in effect. You don't have to keep on making the same decision. You decide what's in and out. You mark the fencing. You can also create policies like these field line markings, and you see those in the picture. Now, on that, there's different policies the church has, maybe a personnel or facility use, maybe safe sanctuary, and you say, and those may move around as needed based upon what you learn and your facility use and different ministry needs. You can work with these policies on an ongoing basis. But notice in both of those, you aren't managing the day-to-day operations or ministry of the church. You're not also kicking that ball around. You're creating the conditions on the field so the game can be played. And so in this way, you're setting like guiding principles and policies for your church members, for your staff, for your pastor. You're setting up what the rules are and then letting them do the ministry. And so folks always want to watch what are some examples. Well, first of all, I want you to know that in the book, we do have several examples. I have some on my website too. Here's some examples of guiding principles. One example is purchasing limits and authority. For instance, you may have a building maintenance team, and I'll say a lot more about that kind of work later, but the idea being that you may have a ministry team of members of the church that have some responsibility. Maybe they've been selected, they're gifted, there's folks who wear tool belts. You give them some purchasing authority up to certain limits. For example, any member of the team can spend up to X dollars. The chair of the team, the facilitator can the ministry team leader can do a little bit higher. And maybe at a certain place, you may have a rule about, well, we need to get bids, and there may be a preference toward local bids and locally owned. So you can set all that up in purchasing limits and set all that up. Departmental budgets are the same way. You may have some staff, their budget's been approved, they're able to spend within their budget, but you may have some things like, well, because of cash flow, anything over $500, you need to ask a supervisor or the treasurer or whoever is the one to okay because of cash flow reasons. You may have an allowance to enter into minor service contracts in a certain way, and it may depend on number of years and that sort of thing or amount. A big one that comes out is how you deal with employee hiring and supervision or terminations, that kind of thing. For some churches, they set up guiding principles wherein at a certain level of employee, the pastor has full authority to hire, fire, terminate, whatever they need to do, discipline. At a certain another level, like a director level or head coordinator, maybe it needs a member of the board involved in the conversation and maybe even in the room, and maybe even senior staff, you need to do it with the board. You can set the barrier the way you want it to. You may even have a separate clause for staff members who are also church members so that the pastor doesn't get stuck in a no-win situation. So if the staff member is also a church member, the board at some level is involved in a discipline or termination situation. And you do that to protect the senior pastor. There's, again, once you set up the guiding principle and you write it and you have this in a handbook, then there's clarity so that your pastor isn't going, well, I know last time we did this time, I'm not really sure what the rules are. Well, by setting up guiding principles, we set up the rules. You can see on the list there some other examples of different policies and guiding principles that could be approved. One of the guiding principles might be all these policies shall be in effect, and you can include safe sanctuary, technology use, personnel, COVID maybe, building access, credit card. You can have a guiding principle that refers to a policy and the date. So these are all ways, instead of making the same decision again and again and again, you set up the principle and then you only get involved as needed. One example I have is on facility use. I know some churches that, outside groups want to use the church facility, and they call the church office and they say, well, okay, I'll take your name and info, and our board meets they just met, so it'll be about another month. And then y'all get a stack of these and you have to go through them all. It'd be a lot easier to have a guiding principle that says, well, here's what's in, here's what's out. And then the exceptions are dealt with by the board. And that way, everyone's clear about the expectations. So that's the guiding principle piece. Another way that the board learns to handle all the work of what it means to be responsible for all these different hats is to be really good at preparations. And here's what I mean by that. I recommend that you create a packet that is shared at least a week before the meeting. It's available to the members of the committee. You can even, if you want to, have a primary packet with most of the information, and then a executive session packet if it has any personnel stuff, like maybe the draft of the consultation form you're going to send the superintendent. That might be in an executive session version of the packet. So, but the packet is here. The idea is that you hand this out ahead of time. And here's what I want to say, that you can look at the list there: the agenda, vital signs, minutes from the previous meeting, financials, goals, progress, bids. You kind of see that. So here's why I'm suggesting that. Got a story. I've been to a lot of meetings. It's 20-something years of ministry. And I remember going to so many. When I walk in the door to the meeting room, what I see is there's a side table and there's all these stacks of paper. And when I walk in, I'm told, okay, pick one of each. In other words, pick one out of each stack. And so I'm grabbing my stuff. And by the time I'm done, I have 20, 30 pieces of paper from all these different things. I got the agenda on top because the agenda, was finalized like 10 minutes before the meeting. And so I've got all this stuff in front of me. And now here I am in the meeting, and I may have shown up early. And so I'm thumbing through it and people are coming in. I'm trying to say hi. And I'm trying to quickly read the financials and maybe some reports or bids. And all this stuff is in front of me. And then we try to have a meeting. And because we did not get this information ahead of time, we're all furiously trying to read it and then also have it reported to us or read to us. And you can see it's a terrible waste of time, because by not receiving it ahead of time, I haven't been able to study it. So that means we have to do reports. So instead, if we do a packet where all that stuff, the agenda, all that information is the minutes, everything sent ahead of time, a week before the meeting, then I can read all that ahead of time. I can mark down if I have any questions and have that ready to go, put little tabs on it. And now I've done all my pre-work. So when we sit down the meeting, there's zero reporting. There's no sitting down and talking about what we should have read, because we've all read it. Now we're asking questions based upon all of our readings. I would suggest even that the covenant that you do as leadership requires the use of a packet and an expectation that every member of the leadership board needs to read the packet before the meeting, because we don't need to be covering stuff that everyone can read ahead of time, and we don't need to be doing reporting and wasting 10 minutes reading a report that we could have been read at home. So you have this packet, and then in your agenda, what you do is there's a lot of items in the packet that you can approve by what's called in Robert's Rules of Order. And I've got my Robert's Rules of Order book right here by my desk. And this is my little short version of parliamentary guide. You can do what's called a consent calendar. And we've done it before in our district conference, for example. And in the consent calendar, everything that needs approval can just be approved in one vote. The minutes and, all the recommendations can be approved. Now, what you do is you start the meeting with that consent calendar piece. You go, okay, you received the packet. We have a list of things to be approved as part of that, as part of the consent calendar. Does anyone need to pull anything out of this? And that's when you pull anything out you need to pull, and you'll deal with it separately. But otherwise, the rest of it can just be approved in one vote. Now, you can imagine in a meeting that takes an hour, how much time that would save. If every one of your committees started, living into the packet now, you'd already be ahead of the game. But think of how much time is wasted by not getting information ahead of time and doing a single consent calendar vote. This can make a huge difference in the life of your leadership. Just this packet, this one practice alone. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a recommended agenda. And this is very similar to the Love, Learn, Lead model that we use actually in our appointive cabinet and cabinet. So if you think of a Love, Learn, Lead, you have a prayer and spiritual formation time. That is, staying connected to God, staying connected to each other, growing spiritually as a group. My suggestion is that it's not just the pastor who does that, but we share it. The example I have is on our cabinet. We all, directors, our bishop, the superintendent, our conference lay leader, we all share the prayer and spiritual formation expectations in leadership. Then you have a learn part of leadership development, because if a board to continue to be a vibrant church, a church that is learning and is nimble, you've got to be learning about the landscape. You got to be learning about what's going on. So you're always learning, doing this leadership development. And then you have some leadership pieces. So Love, Learn, Lead of, talking about connecting to new people. Now, in smaller churches, you may be actually lifting up actual names and just asking, how are these people getting connected? In larger churches, you're more looking at systems, like in statistics, like how are we doing on our follow-up and how many households have been reached, within 48 hours, within 24 hours after the visit, how we doing our follow-up system. You're looking at goals. Again, here's this packet and consent calendar items. And then you spend some time on pressing issues and problem solving. Notice also that we should have a communication item at the end of every meeting. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And again, we close with the word of prayer. I love this Love, Learn, Lead model of the agenda. I think it balances your time well. What you'll find interesting, odd maybe at first, is you spend this chunk of time doing stuff that isn't what you'd consider the meeting. But guess what it is? That prayer time, that spiritual development, that learning, that's just as important as the decisions your board makes. And by investing in your board in this way, you'll find out that when it comes time to make decisions, you're making better decisions and you're making more clarifying and more missional decisions. I wanted to also show you that item a little deeper on communication. So let me do that. So in communication here, I note first that I recommend you conclude every meeting with a communication action item on the agenda. And here's why. You may have attended meetings that had, you did the whole meeting and you go, what did we discuss? Well, doing the communication item means that what you're doing is you're saying right off the bat, here's what we accomplished, and you can list it out. And then you say with those items, okay, who needs to share this and how? And maybe something we talked about needs to just be outlined, and maybe you share responsibilities. So in the church e-news, you say, we had a board meeting last month, and here's some stuff we decided, and just giving you a heads up. Maybe one of the items requires a special article with maybe the chair and the pastor co-writing one, or a member of the team writing it. And that's to share that specific item, like here's what happened at our meeting. It's a good practice of transparency. It builds congregational health and trust and accountability. And having that communication means that meetings, you never feel like they're held in secret. You're really engaging the church in what's going on, and you're staying connected about not only the stuff you do, but the decisions that are made that are underneath that. And so we recommend that every one of your agendas have this communication action item. I also have a few other suggestions, and one is to build intentional feedback times. It could be town halls, listening sessions, whatever. Feedback opportunities that are structured, and you schedule those in as part of your work through the year. Like you can go ahead and at the first of the year kind of figure out when you want those to be. And I've got a few suggestions you'll see in a moment. And the reason is your leadership board needs to be listening as much as it's sharing. And one example of this is, you can imagine a room, your fellowship hall, and you set up round tables, and then you separate the 9 members of the board. Each of them is at a different table, and you're sitting with a group of church members, and you're just talking about, maybe you have a note card on the table, and you have a presenter, and they share some questions, and you build in like feedback time so the people at the round tables can talk to each other with the board member there, and they can facilitate a question Q&A. And that's a really healthy kind of way just to listen to each other in a group. I've seen churches try some other methods, including kind of like the school board thing where everyone's up in a row, and I guess people can come up to the mic and yell at the board. I don't know if that's particularly helpful. I'm not sure it'll get you where you want to go. But I think just being really mindful about what you're trying to accomplish and how you want to try to listen, and how you want to listen to everybody, encourage everyone to share. You just know that some systems create opportunity for conversation. You can also just as easily build feedback systems that shut down conversation. So be mindful of your context in your church and the way you listen to each other. The last point I want to share on board communication is when you had the legacy model of all the committees, a lot of people learned about what was going on in the church from showing up at meetings. You had a trustee meeting, and people sat down, they had some chit chat beforehand, and they had the meeting, and they learned, those 9 people learned about the church that way. Your finance committee learned about what's going on at the church and finance committee meeting. Not the best system in the world, but it was a system. When you consolidate all these committees into one board and you unleash more people for ministry, I mean, you can imagine, instead of having 50 elected folks, now you have 9. It makes a huge difference on you're unleashing more people to be in ministry, but you've lost something, and that is communications. So you need to multiply by 4. In other words, quadruple your communications just to stay even to what you had before when you had the 4 legacy committees. And we often forget that when we consolidate, we've lost a communications portal. So to regain that, you have to be even more intentional. So quadruple the 4 rule on SAS for communications, the 4 times rule. The last piece, one of the last pieces here I'd like to share on the leadership board is the annual rhythm of work. I think if you're really intentional at the first of the year as you're planning into this, you can list out what you want to focus on. Now, every month you'll be doing certain things. That's just part of it. And there'll be stuff that comes up that you have to deal with. But it's important to have ahead of time an idea of some of the bigger responsibilities and annual rhythm of your work, so that you can pace yourself throughout the year. What you don't want is to let stuff build up and then have 10 really important, vital things to be done all in one month. So by breaking it up, and thinking of your work throughout the year, what you can do is try to level the workload even as other stuff pops up that you may not have expected. And so you have in front of you, I'm going to share this now, a annual rhythm of work. And you notice, like January, you elect a trustee chair, which is usually your board chair, and you talk about, you know, roles, responsibilities, and covenant. And if you look here in March, you know, town hall is suggested. In April, a deep financial dive. July is when, you know, churches get new pastors. You may have a town hall. If it, you know, September is, you know, maybe having a strategic planning retreat. You know, you can go to Tenneco or Mount Eagle, one of our other camps, and maybe do a retreat together. November, you kind of finalize budget and charge conference and new leader training. You get the idea how you can kind of work through the year in different ways. Now, your church and you know, the way we do stuff in the Arkansas conference, we may have to shift some stuff around, but the basic theme of this holds, to try to work your processes through a year and to balance that out. Now, I want you to know that when I wrote Mission Possible, we actually have a whole chapter devoted to this. I think like 20 pages, where we go for each month, we have a paragraph or two. So that may help you out a little bit if you want to do a deep dive. This is one last piece I want to share on Church Council, and that is the accountable leadership cycle. And I've been using this since I worked at the Center for Vitality for the conference office. This is a tool I created to help imagine that work of accountability lived out. And when we talk about a culture, my suggestion is take this one tool, give it to all the committees, and say, with every ministry you do, you need to do all these steps. So you need to discern and do research. You take the purpose of the church, its mission and vision, the trajectory, it goes into that. You look around, okay, what ministries we need to do? What's our purpose here? You plan and you set some goals. You implement the ministry. You evaluate it. How was it fruitful? And then you step back, you know, go to that maybe 5,000 foot, maybe go all the way up to 25,000 and reflect. And so this is I think it's a really great tool that you can use throughout the church with staff, with lay committees, where everyone expects a time of evaluation and reflection. We don't think, you know, we think of accountability as blame, when really it is how to make sure that we're really fruitful for Christ's sake. And so I want to encourage this kind of accountability throughout the system. And if your board is doing it, you know, wearing that kind of church council hat, then the whole church can start living into it. So that's my encouragement. Okay, we're going to shift gears again. So if you need to take a pause, you might want to. And when you come back, we'll be doing the staff parish committee. So let's jump into wearing that SPPRC, you know, or staff, pastor, parish committee, parish relations committee hat. I've colored it a red hat there. And when we start talking about that hat, it's really the personnel work of the church. The staff pastor parish relations committee responsibilities are 258.2 in the discipline. There's a lot of them. Now, I haven't actually listed them all here. I mean, there's other stuff like, you know, meeting with candidates, you know, to recommend them to the district committee on ordained ministry and ministry candidates. But here's the basics of the work. You're dealing with personnel matters. You invest in the relationship with clergy leaders, do mission and ministry responsibility, such as encouragement and support and accountability for the pastor and the staff. There's some fiduciary compliance work that you need to do with child protection. And you know, in Arkansas, there's state laws about mandated reporter that every staff member who gets a paycheck from the church is by law a mandated reporter for DHS for any child neglect, abuse, or any other, you know, things like that. And so you need to train everyone, janitors, all the staff, people who answer the phone call. They're all mandated reporters, so you got to do training for that. Also, when your board wears that staff parish hat, you're also the connection with us, the superintendents, district superintendents, and connectional matters and clergy evaluation. So when we send a consultation, information, you're filling that out as the whole board. What we don't want to have is, 2 or 3 people filling it out and turn it in. So the whole board has to fill it out and turn it in and have a piece of that. So that's all the staff parish stuff there. Now, I want you to notice there's a word in here about relationship. We're going to dig into that a bit more. But first, I need to share about executive session. Now, when you're switching hats like we do in a leadership board with all these different functions, there comes time when you need to move into a confidentiality. And confidentiality is not secrets. Appropriate confidentiality, though, is by the book of discipline required whenever the board is meeting as the staff parish relations committee. So when you're functioning in that model and under that realm, the leadership board should move into an executive session. And there's all the rules of the book of discipline about confidentiality is in effect. And when you move to executive session, you need to switch your set of the minutes to the executive session minutes. You should hold all that truly in confidence. You should be able to share honestly with each other. If there are guests in the room, such as other staff, or maybe others that are, you have the table of people. We've had our table and all these images, and there might be people sitting around because it's an open meeting. You have to excuse the other staff, excuse the others, because now you've moved into executive session for staff parish work. And that's not being mean, that's following the rules. And I, as a superintendent, have high expectations when your leadership board is operating as a staff parish committee, that you will follow all the rules of confidentiality. Examples of this are maybe you are partnering with a pastor to take a disciplinary action against an employee. Maybe you're filling out the consultation forms for the bishop or DS or cabinet. Maybe I'm visiting with you all about your future and the appointment status. In those situations, it's going to be confidential, and it's required to be by discipline. So we need to be real clear when you move to executive session, and note that in your minutes. Now, I do want to spend a little time talking about relational nature of the staff parish relations committee. One of the pastors I really respect, former DS Phil Hathcock, always said, focus on the relations of the title SPRC. And that's important. The relational skills for the leadership board and staff parish role are, and I've listed them here. First of all, maintain, again, appropriate and disciplinary confidentiality. Create a climate of accountability and engagement. Use listening and feedback instead of polling for complaints. In other words, don't go around asking for anonymous complaints because you never know how to judge them. When I was serving as a pastor, if someone was doing an anonymous complaint, I did not know how to handle that because I did not know if they were heavily invested in the life of the church. Were they a person that shows up, Christmas and Easter, and then only to complain about the preacher? Were they a highly engaged member? Were they coming as part of a group, or was it very much individual and personal? And anonymous complaints do no one any good. And there really is moving more into the realm of rumor or gossip. And so you need to, as the board, put a stop to that and demand that folks, if they're going to have a concern, they need to attach their name to it. Also, staff parish, while the facts may be required to be confidential, you can always make processes public. So, for instance, when I'm working with the staff parish committee about maybe a new appointment, I say, I can't get you with names or something yet, or maybe we're talking about some things, but here's what we can do. We can talk about the process. You can talk about the fact that we do profile works and that we work with the bishop and the cabinet. We take that profile that I'm doing with the local church. You can get into that. If you're doing a disciplinary action, against one of the staff members, you can't get in the details, but you could share we're working a process, and our process is outlined in a whole system that we have. And so please trust that we're following our process. When you have that relational hat on with staff parish, I think you can also think about how you give feedback. Is it constructive? Is it going to help the person do better? Is it going to help us be accountable to the mission? And also be willing to listen, because there might be expectations that are not realistic, or maybe their expectations based more on nostalgia than on the future mission. So maybe some of those expectations need to be rethought. And the board's job is not to tell the pastor to change, but instead tell the pastor we need to talk about our narrative here, and then to flip around and to work with the pastor on trying to share the why beneath newer expectations based upon the reality of our mission field today. Also, I think, we think about missional accountability. I do want to be clear that we have some very clear conference rules on sexual misconduct. They're in the book of discipline. They're also in some papers that y'all signed at annual conference. You need to follow those clearly and document and report any allegations on sexual misconduct immediately to the district superintendent, so they can be dealt with appropriately using the process outlined in the book of discipline and conference policy. That is an expectation I have, and all the DSs have, for every staff parish committee. We do not cover stuff up. We handle it appropriately. And so these issues need to be worked through in the system that is provided. The last place I would like to say is, not all church conflict is equal. And when you're wearing that staff parish hat, remember that sometimes when a church is in conflict, conflict is a sign of change and not of unhealth. Now, I'll put an asterisk on that and say sometimes it is unhealth. Sometimes it is a bad match that, pastor and church just not working out together. But I also want to be clear that we're living in a time of deep cultural shifts and challenges. We're dealing with a pandemic and trying to climb out of that. There's a lot of change happening, and change makes people anxious and makes people grieve. There's all kinds of grief. We have lost a lot of folks to death and to illness. We have created enormous economic and personnel stresses on the system throughout our culture, and our church is not immune from that. So some conflict may also be coming out of all these structural changes and challenges. And they also might be conflict might be showing up because of attempts of the church to live into ministry challenges that we're facing. In other words, shifting gears to connect and reach out to new people, and using new methods to reach out to people could in itself be a creation of church conflict. So I think we don't always need to start with blame, but instead start with listening and unpacking the why beneath the conflict, because conflict may be a sign of growth, not of unhealth. And so let's figure out the why and be really clear then how we want to communicate what's actually going on as we need to in the church. I do want to talk a little bit more about the leadership board and the staff now, because you'll be working with, first of all, the pastor on how the authority shall go on staff supervision, evaluation, hiring, firing. Please work with your pastor to build guiding principles around all this authority and responsibility. If not, what we end up doing is the pastor doesn't know, it's not clear, and it creates inaction, or it creates bad feelings. Some churches are delegating that supervision to try to get the triangulation out. The leadership board can build any boundaries in they want to. But remember here, when we talk about these guiding principles, they're not permanent. They can be changed by the leadership board at any time. I think you just communicate the change. You go, okay, we've learned something, and shift gears. And that's one of the great things about guiding principles is you can take decisions that you make and say, okay, that was the decision we made. That was helpful. I think we're going to face this again and again. How can we turn this one decision into a guiding principle so it now becomes part of the fabric of our leadership without having to come back together and spend another 15, 20 minutes figuring this decision out again and again and again? You can build that guiding principle, and then 3 or 4 years later, you have it. And if you need to shift it, you can shift it. That's allowed. You're the board. You can do that. I'm going to shift gears, think about shifting, and let's talk about the finance hat. So if you need to pause here, you can, or switch in your discipline. If you're following along in the book of discipline, we're going to move to paragraph 258.4. When the finance responsibilities are listed there. And so these become now the financial duties of the leadership board. You got budgeting, administration of funds. You have to follow donor intent, with bequests and donor intent. Those have some legal binding to your church. When a donor gives something and they've written something in the memo, you're required by law to spend the money that way. When you accept the gift, you're now required to deal with the gift. And it might not be a check, it might be a piece of property. It may even be a piece of property you don't want to own. That's kind of the trustee section we'll talk about later. You're also responsible to work with the pastor on stewardship and fundraising and income generation. One of the items that if you watch our other finance committee video that the Arkansas Conference provides is, the finance committee is not about saying no to expending money. The finance committee's first responsibility is to generate the income needed to fulfill the budget and the ministry of the church. It's about income generation, not just cutting the budget or cutting expenses. So work with the pastor on how to do that. I think there's a reporting to the congregation piece here to communicate, be transparent. I think if a church can trust its board and be shown kind of where you are, I think that trust has a big impact on giving. If folks don't know where money is going, folks are very hesitant to give. So you need to be very transparent. Also, when you wear that finance hat, there's some fiduciary responsibilities, such as the audit and internal control policies, and make sure that you have finance secretary and treasurer compliance with those. That's for everyone's sake. Now, I'm going to first talk here on that finance hat about budgeting and reporting. First of all, on budgeting is, creating a budget based on the mission and vision of the church. You can partner with the pastor, maybe a stewardship campaign again, to raise sufficient income. Again, you can use work teams, you can use other teams for this. The board's not required to do it all by themselves, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. You're also responsible in partnership with the pastor to administer the funds and use guiding principles and your values to get there. On reporting, again, transparency is vital. So you should have regular reporting to the church, and work with your finance secretary and your treasurer to make sure that you all have the financial reports that you need as a board to fulfill your responsibilities. You have that when you get those reports, and preferably a week ahead of time before the meeting. You need to, if those are not the reports that are helpful to make decisions, you need better reports. And so one suggestion is, to have reports that go back and look at not only at this year or this month, but to look at the year in the context. And I would suggest, I really highly recommend not only looking at this year, but looking maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years in the past. And so you can compare your month to month to month to month in the past to see where you are in the year and to get a better feel of everything in context. I'll use an example. I was working with one church that only looked a month at a time. And I said, I can't do anything with it. I said, I don't know when your insurance is due, because it could, your bottom line, if you think of it just like a checkbook, well, if the insurance is due next month, that's a huge expense. So, because it's only, every quarter or every 6 months, I can't tell where you are because I can't tell what expenses have already been done if you only look month to month. So that's why you have to look at everything in the context of the year and look at multiple years. And so you're comparing apples to apples throughout the year as you're flowing through your budget year. I do want to share this next piece, and again, the Arkansas Conference video that our administrative services department did are on finance and the work of the treasurer. They have a whole 30-minute video just on finance stuff. I encourage you to watch it. But one of the items they'll talk about there is the fraud triangle. And with the idea being that when there is fraud or embezzlement or some financial problem, it usually involves these three pieces working in this group. There's a pressure that the person may feel, maybe medical expenses, maybe, job loss of a spouse, maybe they're having their own medical issues, bills that came up, kids' bills. There's rationalization, which is, I worked so hard, I deserve a little something here. The church really can't affect those too much. The only component the church can really impact is the third piece in the fraud triangle, and that's opportunity. And that is why we really have an expectation of following audits and internal control policies. Now, I'm going to leave this slide up a little bit while I talk, but I want you to know that our administrative services center at the conference office with Todd Burris as the treasurer, he has some financial review guides and some internal control policies that are good for different size churches. They all come out of experience, and we highly recommend that you use either those policies or come up with some of your own that fit your situation. And you'll have to get pretty detailed on this. Now, as a leadership board, you may not be writing every word of these yourself. You may be working with others, but you're ultimately responsible for approving the policies, and you're ultimately responsible for ensuring that they're followed. So you're working with other folks or staff to ensure they're followed. And so internal control policies could be, identifying the counting team. You say there shall be a counting team. Now, you may not in the policy write the names down, but other documents such as your charge conference documents, guess what? We have a space in there every year to fill in the names of the two non-family and non-household members to count the offering. You have a treasurer and a financial secretary, two separate people, and they can't be in the same household. If you think about that treasurer and finance secretary, the way to think about it is the treasurer is kind of accounts payable, and the finance secretary is accounts receivable. In other words, income. So you have policies for all this. Now, on the audit piece, there is an audit guide that is provided by our annual conference and also GCFA. And it actually suggests at different size churches and different budgets, you have different rules around audit. So a certain size church, they suggest an audit every year. At another kind of tier of size of churches, it could be you need to do an audit every other year. And in the odd years, you do a financial review that's more internal, but it uses an audit guide that's not a full-blown, few $1,000s audit. For our smaller churches, there's actually, if you have a bit of mathematical acumen and you can follow directions, we have a financial review guide that you can use to follow the process, and that will fulfill the discipline requirements for an audit. It's basically an independent evaluation of the reports and records and the internal control. So you can actually follow the step-by-step process in our guide and work through that. Now, you could even team up with another church. For example, two churches on a charge, they could each do each other's financial review. You could have one person or two people on each and switch off and do it for the other church. Just, you can't have that auditor also be someone who's either paid or a member of the board. They have to be separate. So that's some processes you can have in place. Now, in all this with finance, I want to say something. First of all, I want to be real clear. The job of the board when it serves as finance is not about making sure that no money ever gets spent. Spending money on ministry is kind of the point. I mean, the resources that God's given us to make a difference, to transform the world. So a budget is a spiritual document that identifies the missional priorities of the congregation. You can say you're about ABC, but if those items, either through personnel or direct expenses, are not being invested in, guess what? ABC is not going to happen. Budget is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of churches on what they're really going to focus on and call a priority. The second is when the leadership board wears the finance hat, the members need to focus on stewardship, which is a part of discipleship, and not scarcity. In other words, there is a different focus. You can have stewardship and the abundance of giftedness you have in your members. God's given the church the resources it needs to fulfill its mission there. If you focus only on scarcity and cutting, it's going to be really hard to live into that stewardship model, that opportunity to live into God's dream that the church is called to. Okay, we're going to shift gears once again and move to trustees hat. So if you need to take a little break, you can. And when we come back, we will talk about the trustees hat. And so we're closing in on the end of this seminar. So on trustees, the first thing I want to share here is there's a difference between a building maintenance team and the board of trustees. Now, this does not seem odd to folks, but I think over time, we have misidentified the work of the board of trustees. Now, I'll give you an example. I remember I was serving at one church, and when the plumbing went haywire in the parsonage, I was pretty much told to call the board of trustees. And he came with his toolbox, his tool belt, and fixed the water problem in the parsonage. And I'm glad he did. That was great. But that actually was not a trustee's function. We need to think of trustees of the church less in the way of tool belts and more in the way of the elected legal board of directors. If you think of a university, a board of trustees, they're probably not going around to the dorm rooms, unplugging the toilets and changing light bulbs. They're doing some, overseeing the property as fiduciaries. They're talking about insurance coverage and tenants, and you think about bequests and trusts that you receive, and endowments and investments, the incorporation status with the Secretary of State office, working with the church attorney, dealing with anything that may involve legal issues or lawsuits, policies for facility use, or setting like long-term maintenance plans. For instance, I served a church once that every time we needed a new HVAC system, air conditioner, heat, we had to rent a crane. So we had a multi-year process for understanding when we needed to purchase air conditioning systems, because it was cheaper to change 2 or 3 out than to keep on renting a crane every year. So we had to be really thoughtful about our process there. That's trustee work, is that kind of work. Building maintenance work, the kind of tool belt, it's not trustees. It doesn't have to be elected. And most folks that wear tool belt, the tool belt kind of ministry, they don't want to be involved in this other stuff. So when your leadership board is wearing that board of trustees hat, they don't have to also be dealing with some of the kind of day-to-day maintenance stuff. Instead, what we really suggest is have a separate building maintenance team. It operates under the pastor or staff direction. They're assigned a budget, maybe some guiding principles for spending thresholds. Members are selected and recruited, not elected. And they're folks that are good at fixing stuff. And they may work, if you have a custodian, they may work in tandem with the custodian. And it's a great ministry for people with a certain kind of giftedness. And it's very different than what your leadership board is doing as the board of trustees of the incorporated body called, Anytown United Methodist Church. So first of all, when we think of trustees, let's separate those functions out and let the trustee be what it is legally, and then set free, unleash the church members who are great at building maintenance to be great at building maintenance, and let them do that work and just care for the building and the facilities and the church van and all that. And then if they have something they need, they can let the leadership board know, and so it can be incorporated in the budget or included as part of a larger maintenance plan. So when we're wearing our board of trustees hats, let's remember the church facilities, the equipment, all of that. It's the job of it is not to stay pretty forever. It's to fulfill God's mission. And when the leadership board wears the trustee hat as institutional fiduciaries, the members need to focus on the stewardship of God's resources, in other words, the keeping up and the mission of the church. Now, the trustees are fiduciaries, and what that means is they have a legal responsibility to care for the institution and to care for it in a way that is supportive of the trust clause in the Book of Discipline. The trust clause says that, and this is in the 2500s here, it talks about all the property and the endowments, finance, everything is held in trust. And so that's why you have trustees, but it's held in trust for the furtherance of the church's mission and for the denomination as we live out our mission to make disciples for the transformation of the world. Now, that means that trustees are fiduciaries. And to use another example of fiduciary, my wife and I have we wrote a last will and testament, and we have an executor of our estate. And so if something were to happen to us, my brother-in-law would be the executor, and he would be, as the executor, a fiduciary. And there'd be legal expectations that he would follow the will as it is written. Now, he may not think we made a good decision on how we wanted the proceeds to go, but it didn't matter what he thought. What mattered was he was a fiduciary actor, and he is required to legally to administer the estate as written in the will. In the same way as trustees, you are legally required and disciplinary required to be a fiduciary, and you're responsible for the institutional status of the church. It may not always be fun. And, if the church ever gets sued, it's the leadership board and it's the 9 members of the board of trustees, often listed in the Secretary of State's office directors. Their names are on the lawsuit. So it's a huge responsibility there. And I just want to keep on pressing on that that role, we do need to keep it in its proper focus of the depth of that role in the discipline. It's a lot more than some of the building maintenance stuff we often think of. So the last piece before we kind of wrap things up is about work teams. Now, I've just really come to love and value what work teams can do for your leadership board. And when I talk about work teams, here's what I mean. I know that the 9 members of the leadership board can't accomplish all this, but they can help delegate some work appropriately and then make sure everything that then they're responsible for. So the members of the leadership board, of course, they're nominated. Let me turn back here. They're nominated as spiritual leaders. And here's the work team piece, as spiritual leaders. And in the nominations work, what I often share is, you're not looking for folks who are, okay, we're going to build a board, so we need someone with maybe a legal background for business no, you're looking for spiritual leaders. And at times, your work will require the help of outside experts and outside disciples and through work teams. Work teams can be assigned short-term projects. For example, you may say, okay, I need one or two of our board members to work with the pastor and the treasurer and the maybe the ministry coordinator, and there's about 2 other folks in the life of the church they can grab up, and say about 2 other folks grab in that maybe have some business idea, ability to business background, and come up with a draft budget. And so take a month and a half, do that work, and bring to us a draft budget. Another example, and I've actually used this before, is we needed to do a new personnel policy at one of my churches. And so I was an executive pastor. We had a member of staff parish. We had one of our young leaders who was not really wanting to do a 3-year term on the board, but was willing to help. We asked him to serve, and he had an HR background. professionally in a company. So he had that HR stuff, and we brought him in, and then we brought in one of our folks who works with the child care center and knew all those health department rules around child care centers. So we make sure we didn't run afoul of that. And we were a sub team, this work team, and we created a draft version of the personnel policy. And then we pulled in our chancellor, our lawyer for the church, and that person took a look at it too. And then we worked up that draft. And then we brought the first draft to the board, and the board looked at it and they said, well, let's do this and this. And we had a few questions. We said, well, do we want to go the PTO, like this pay time off, or do we want to go this method? So we had some questions for the board, and we let the board, and we said, the board, okay, here's our final product, our draft. And we have 3 questions. Board, could you answer it so that we can bring the next draft? And so the board made a few decisions, and we said, thank you. Took it back, did a little more work, brought back draft number 2, and it included all their things. And then they were able to look at that and they make a change or 2, and then they approved the final result. And that's how we got a new personnel policy. So we didn't need the whole board working on every detail, but the board was ultimately responsible for it. And that's the important thing. A leadership board always needs to act as a full committee, because it can delegate, but it can never abdicate its governance role. The other value of these work teams I really love is it's a great way to use potential and former leaders. And here's what I mean by that. Maybe your chair rolled off, and they have some great institutional knowledge. Now they're the former chair of the board, and they've had 3 years of great institutional knowledge. They want to keep their hand in, but they've done their 3-year term, and they don't really want to jump back on right now. Well, what you can do is you can have a work team where you ask that leader, hey, could you serve for 3 months or 2 months on this work team to help us maybe come up with a plan with the pastors on reaching a new subdivision that they're being built nearby or something like that, so that they can take their institutional knowledge and help. Another example for adding to the work team and broadening beyond the 9 to including more of the disciples in the leadership of the church is using work teams as a way to invite some of your rising leaders, your budding leaders into some of this work. In other words, maybe as part of your leadership development, you're thinking of, okay, we have some folks that are newer to the church or newer into leadership. We can pull them in, let them serve on a work team for a few months and see what they think about church governance. And it might be a giftedness they really love. And that might be a future person. We want to tell the nominating committee, hey, Jane Smith was on a work team, and it was her first time to be on church leadership. She loved it. I think she'd be a great board member next time we're looking at board members. And so that's a way to kind of bring in both experienced leaders and also new leaders into the mix. So it's not just the 9 people. And by doing the work team, you can be really creative in that. So here's some examples of some work teams. You may have a work team on a draft of the initial guiding principles. Maybe, as I said, the personnel handbook, or reaching a new subdivision, initial budget draft. Maybe you want to get the goals kind of finalized. You had the strategic ministry planning retreat. We need to kind of turn our raw material that we came up with over the weekend into something more actionable. So you get those goals and you kind of work them and wordsmith them. So you can bring it back to the board. Maybe looking at a multi-site ministry possibility. You may have a team that's a discernment and research team to do that research, and then to listen and to learn and to study and come back with some suggestions on next steps. Those are all examples of work team projects that could be incredibly valuable to the church. Now, we've gone through a lot. We've gone through your church council, your finance trustees, all that. And all of that, I will say, remember to, keep your holistic leadership lens on. It is really easy when you're serving in all these different functions to start divvying up the work or isolating the work from each other. So keep everything, your approach holistic. Keep your lens holistic so that all through, as you're moving from work that you might call finance or staff pairs or trustees or ed council, remember, yeah, in some ways it's separate, but it's a unified work that we're doing all in fulfillment of the mission that God's given us. I do want to say that there are some unique and challenges that have to do with using a simplified accountable structure. It's not always the easiest thing to manage because, that's a lot of different pieces you're trying to put in one team. So I do want to address two common challenges of this structure. First is the communication challenge. And so my suggestion is because a board can often become isolated, to have and create multiple communication streams. You communicate till you think people are tired of it. And then that might be just enough. Build trust and transparency in the church. Another challenge for a simplified accountable structure leadership board is making your decisions with accuracy and effectiveness, because it's really easy to kind of have a shotgun, like start shooting everywhere, start trying to do everything. You've got to isolate a bit more your priorities. In other words, use your meeting time well, use the agenda we suggest. Don't just fall back into reporting. Use accountable leadership and use guiding principles. If not, everything's going to be shoot from the hip, and it's going to be last minute, and it's going to be hard to keep track of. So you have to be incredibly intentional when you use this system of this simplified board. And to do that is set up the processes necessary to move through the work. Finally, I do want to remind us again what the work is, and that is the Great Commission. We're all accountable to the Great Commission. So go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age. We are all accountable to this Great Commission. We're all accountable to the mission of the church, to the trajectory of the Arkansas Annual Conference, create vital congregations that make disciples of Jesus Christ, who make disciples, equipped and sent to transform lives, communities, and the world. That's our work we have ahead of us. I do remind you that if you have questions about transitioning to a simplified structure or implementing the leadership board model, please contact your district office. Your district superintendents can work with you on this model and how to live into it. Don't think you're going with it alone. Remember, we have a lot of churches in Arkansas. A lot of them are starting to use this structure. Let's try to do it first the right way, but let's also do it in a way that's in connection with your superintendent, because it is new and different, and it takes learning some new ways to go about leadership to make it truly effective and live into it. If you're having challenges with the system, check and make sure that you're using the system that's advised and recommended, and you're following all those recommendations. You could find that making a tweak here and there and following those recommendations could unlock some of the challenges that you've been dealing with. And finally, I want to tell you how thankful I am to you. As one of your superintendents, it's really a privilege to serve and to partner alongside you in ministry. I do have my website there, and it has information about the structure and some free downloads, and you're welcome to those. But really, I just want you to know how much I appreciate you saying yes for the nomination to be a member of a leadership board, to say yes to following Christ as a disciple, and not only a disciple, but a disciple who's also a leader of God's holy church. Your leadership really does matter. And I want you to know how grateful I and all the other members of the cabinet and our bishop are for what you're doing to lead the church in this new era and this new season that God has before us. So let's continue to make disciples. Let's continue to send disciples, to equip and send them out into God's world, all to transform lives, communities, and the world. This we ask, and this we are sent in the name of Jesus. God bless you, and have a great, great year.